Welcome back. This is part 2 of the 53 lecture from AP Bio. We left off video 1 talking about these two questions. What environmental factors stop a population from growing indefinitely? So why aren't all populations exponential? And then why are some populations stable while others are not? I think it helps to think about the population being density independent, but it also helps to think about the limiting factors being density independent. So we'll look a little bit more at each of these. But an independent population, the birth and death rates don't change with the population density. In a density dependent population, they do. So in the case of density dependent birth and death rates, well, if you aren't near someone of the opposite gender, you can't reproduce. Especially think about plants. Uh, you can't move to another country or move to another town if you're a cottonwood tree or something along those lines. So density dependent birth and death rates are influenced by a lot of factors. And if you notice, a lot of these things are going to be things you run out of. Territory, this word is going to affect it because if you need a 10-acre territory that you can't share with anyone, that's going to limit your population size. There's some examples of density dependent regulation, competition for resources, diseases, of course, because they'll spread more quickly, predation, and intrinsic factors like those are going to be unique to each individual species. But things like limits on food and things like that, if you have to overwinter or things along those lines. So each of these has a little bit more information here. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on them. You guys are all intelligent people. You can read through the mechanisms of density dependent regulation. There's also a video on slide 50 of the textbook lecture. If any of this isn't making sense, that's a really good video that'll help you understand this stuff a little bit more. It's textbooky, but it brings home some of those ideas. It looks like maybe I accidentally deleted my density independent slides. So density independent control are going to be things that affect every single organism. So that's where maybe a natural disaster hits. A flood takes out a whole population. Doesn't matter if there's one organism or a million organisms, they're all going to drown. Or a volcano erupts or an earthquake happens, something along those lines. Pollution, climate change are density independent limiting factors. So let's move on to stability and fluctuation. This was the second question we started this video with. Why are some populations stable while others aren't? Well, it depends on the population, really. You see major collapses in the moose population on this Isle Royale occurred in response to harsh winter one year, and then in response to increasing predator population in other years. So that's kind of what you're seeing here. Sometimes the population crashes due to a large amount of predators. Sometimes the population crashes not because there's a huge amount of predators, but because of a really cold winter. So I guess what I'm trying to say is it's a convoluted picture. Some species go through what they call boom or bust cycles. So boom, bust, boom, bust. So the population skyrockets and then crashes. That's kind of the idea behind a boom or bust cycle. So there are two hypotheses. One that the hare's population cycle follows the cycle of winter food supply. I think I said the word cycle like 15 times in there, so sorry about that. So if that one is correct, the cycle should stop if the food supply is increased. So if we put food out for these organisms or we bring in some sort of invasive prey for them, and here, additional food was provided experimentally, and the whole population increased in size, but continued to cycle. So that data doesn't support that hypothesis. Second hypothesis is that it's driven by pressure from other predators. 95% of the hares were killed by predators, including lynx, coyotes, and hawks. So that does support this hypothesis. This is an example of scientific inquiry that your book brought out, and I thought it really I normally delete those, but I thought this one really showed kind of the thought process that goes into tracking one of these graphs or interpreting one of these graphs. Another idea that's important to think about in terms of small populations, especially, are meta-populations. So these are going to be small groups or small subpopulations that are linked by immigration and emigration. Think about birds on opposite sides of a mountain. Everybody's not going to go back and forth all the time, but somebody can. So here's an example using butterflies where all these dots, the black dots, are places that they live. The white dots are places that they have lived in the past, and they migrate around. So each of these dots is going to be a metapopulation. An individual's ability to move between populations depends on a number of factors. Check out this genetic piece that gets rolled in. That's definitely one of the updates between last year's edition and this year's edition. Uh, these butterflies that are heterozygous for this one gene can go further at low temperatures than homozygous individuals. So they're going to be able to travel from, say, here to here, where a homozygous individual is only going to be able to travel from here to here. So that could impact the gene pool at the new metapopulation, the new subpopulation. So 53.6 is talking about trying to apply all these ideas to the human population. Of course, we are a population, so we fit a lot of the same patterns, but we also can change the patterns more so than natural species. No population can grow indefinitely. We're certainly no exception to that. The next slide, I'll show you the population increased really slowly until about 1650 and then started to grow like crazy. Population is now more than 7.2 billion. We add about 300,000 people to the planet every day. And we'll get to that last point here in just another slide. So see the population, there were some ticks. We got some advances in medical care and things along those lines. And then the plague happened, and that was really bad. And then life took off. What you're seeing in this graph is our population growth rate. So yes, our population is still growing, but it's growing by a slower percentage. So it's growing more slowly than it was in the 2000s, and definitely more slowly than it was in the 70s. So to maintain population stability, a regional human population could do one of two things. A lot of people being born, a lot of people dying, or not either. So low birth rate, low death rate. Again, zero population growth. If those two things are canceling out, then the growth rate is zero. Unless we have a lot of immigration or emigration, and then that throws it off as well. Demographic transition is something we don't need to spend a ton of time on. If you were in apes, you'd learn all about it, but it's essentially the 4 steps that it takes to get from a hunter-gatherer society where you've got lots of basically really high birth rate and really high death rate, up through a developed and a shrinking country where the population is dwindling. Every society fits into one of those 4 boxes. So it's essentially the idea that hunter-gatherers are high birth rate, high death rate. Then something happens to bring down the death rate, typically better access to healthcare, better access to clean water and sanitation and things like that. But you've still got a really high birth rate. Then the next step is that birth rate comes down and the death rate stays down. You still have access to healthcare, but now you have access to family planning, contraceptives, and things along those lines. And then the 4th stage is that shrinking population where the birth rate goes below the death rate. So your population is declining. One important factor, especially for human population studies or human demography, is the age structure. So we can look at a country's age structure diagram and we can say, okay, Afghanistan has a bunch of babies and not very many old people, so we need to make sure we're expanding industry here. Because all these people are going to need a place to live, a place to work, a place to they're going to be a growing population. Here in the U.S., notice this is 2010, the baby boomer generation was a bubble in our age structure diagram, and we realized, oh no, we're going to have a huge chunk of population that's coming out of the workforce and isn't paying taxes and doesn't have access to health care. So we better make some sort of a change. So one of the motivators behind the Affordable Care Act was this bubble right here. Population scientists and demographers were looking at this big bubble saying, uh-oh, The future is scary. And then there are countries like Italy and Germany and places like that where the base is about the same size as the old people. Notice the sex ratio is thrown off here in Italy. Think about how World War II could have affected that, and World War One maybe in the upper reaches of this 85 plus. Always women outlive men too, so that is pretty typical for the right side of the graph to be a little bigger than the left side of the graph. So again, we can use these things to make projections about what the population is going to do in the future. Last thing I forgot to mention, we often will break these into pre-reproductive age, post-reproductive age, and reproductive age people. Because again, that gives us a really good idea of what's coming down the line. If we've got a whole bunch of people that are making babies, this graph is just going to continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Infant mortality and life expectancy are two kind of vocab words that get rolled in here. Infant mortality is going to be the amount of babies that survive their first year. And life expectancy, of course, is how long you should expect to live based upon your birth year. Global life expectancy has increased since 1950, but here in the last couple of years, we've seen it decrease in the U.S. Internationally, things like decaying infrastructure and social upheaval and disease, civil wars, things along those lines, all factor into global life expectancy. So it's interesting to think about applying the carrying capacity idea. How many humans can the biosphere support? Many population ecologists say somewhere between 8 to 10.5 billion people is about all that we can. Oh, I'm sorry. Those are the projections of the amount of people that will be on the planet in 2050. Carrying capacity limits, I've seen 8 billion and I've seen some as high as like 15 billion. It's hard to calculate because it's food availability changes. We go through the green revolution and the amount of food changes and the impact on the climate changes and our conditions are changing while the population is changing. So it's a hard target to nail down. Limits on human population size are ecological footprint. We've studied a ton about that. How much land do we essentially take up per person? We know that we are not so good. Australia is not so good. You might not know that. This is global hectares. So we have a really large ecological footprint, whereas some of these countries down here, some of these countries over here have a really small ecological footprint. A lot of our ecological footprint is based around our electricity use. And then the other major factor is going to be our oil use from driving our vehicles. You see the uneven electrification of the planet. This is an image of the planet at night. Lot of lights here, lot of lights here, not so many here, not so many here, not so many here. So it's not surprising that there were a lot of lights here, there were a lot of lights here, and if we go back to this map, orange, 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 orange. So the lights are in the places where there's a lot of electricity. Our carrying capacity could be limited by food space, non-renewable energy sources, or buildup of waste, but we can make social changes. We can make impact changes. We can switch to renewable resources. We can find a way to remove some of our toxic wastes and our e-wastes and things like that. We can find a way to grow more food. We can find a way to build vertically, not horizontally. We can get rid of things like territoriality, or however I struggled to say that word the whole video. But that's essentially chapter 53. We'll pick up with 54 next time.